My name is Evan Mercer, I'm 31, and I work maintenance for a small community college outside Knoxville. 2 years ago I took a week off in October and decided to do a solo hike through part of the Cumberland Plateau, nothing extreme, just 5 days on a trail system I'd heard good things about from other hikers. I'd camped alone before plenty of times and never had any kind of experience I'd describe as paranormal or even especially strange. That's part of why this still bothers me now. First couple days were completely normal, cold mornings, decent weather, not many people on the trail. I crossed paths with maybe 4 hikers total after the first day, and after that I mostly had the woods to myself, which honestly was what I wanted. I like being out there when things get quiet enough that you stop thinking about work and phones and everything else for a while. The third afternoon I reached an older shelter that wasn't on some of the newer maps anymore. I only knew about it because somebody mentioned it in a hiking forum from years earlier. Apparently people still used it occasionally if they got caught out after dark. The side trail leading to it was easy to miss, narrow and partly overgrown, and the farther downhill I went the stranger the air started to feel. Not dangerous, not even threatening exactly, just wrong in a way that's hard to explain now. The woods got noticeably quieter the closer I got to the shelter, not the normal kind of quiet you get in remote places either. This felt dense, like sound wasn't carrying properly. I could still hear my own boots on the ground, but they sounded dull somehow, flattened. The shelter itself sat low in a hollow beside a shallow creek bed filled with dark standing water and wet leaves. It looked older than I expected. The support beams had black stains running down them from years of moisture, and the roof sagged enough in the middle that I remember wondering if snow had partially collapsed it at some point. There were signs people still stopped there sometimes: an empty propane canister, burned firewood, fishing line hanging from one of the nails near the entrance. But the place still felt abandoned in the way old buildings sometimes do, where you immediately get the sense that nobody stays longer than they need to. I dropped my pack inside and the smell hit me almost immediately. Wet wood mostly, cold mud, something mineral underneath it, not rotten exactly, more like the smell that comes out of the ground when you dig deep enough into wet soil. I remember noticing carvings along the back wall while I was setting up my sleeping bag, initials mostly, dates, trail names, normal shelter stuff. But near the lower corner somebody had carved a single word deeper than all the others. No explanation after it, no joke, no extra words, just that one word cut hard enough into the wood that the groove still looked pale underneath the weathering. I actually laughed a little when I saw it because it felt cliché at the time, like somebody trying too hard to creep people out. I really wish now that I'd kept walking another few miles instead of staying there that night. I made dinner just before dark. Instant noodles and coffee, nothing unusual. I remember sitting near the entrance of the shelter for a while afterward, listening to water move somewhere farther down the hollow. The strange thing was that I could hear the creek perfectly, but almost nothing else. No insects, no owls, no branches moving. Even though higher up along the ridge the trees were swaying hard enough that I could hear wind moving through them. Down near the shelter itself the air stayed completely still. I ended up going to sleep earlier than I planned because there really wasn't anything else to do once it got dark. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, turned my headlamp off, and within a few minutes the entire shelter disappeared into blackness. I woke up at some point during the night with the immediate feeling that somebody else was there. Not a sound at first, just that sensation you get when another person enters a room while your back is turned. Something in the space felt occupied now in a way it hadn't before. I stayed completely still, listening. For maybe 30 seconds I heard nothing except my own breathing. Then from the far corner of the shelter came the sound of wood settling under weight, very slight. A slow creak followed by the faint noise of fabric shifting against timber, like someone lowering themselves carefully into a seated position. Every rational part of my brain tried to explain it immediately. Another hiker coming in late, somebody avoiding using a flashlight out of courtesy, normal trail stuff. But the longer I listened the less normal it felt. The person never moved again after sitting down. No backpack unzipping, no footsteps, no cough, no clearing their throat, nothing, just breathing, slow steady breathing from the opposite corner of the shelter. I remember realizing after a while that I was holding my own breath without meaning to because I was trying to hear better. The smell in the shelter changed gradually over the next several minutes too. That same mineral smell from earlier got stronger until it reminded me almost exactly of freshly opened ground, cold wet dirt from deep underground. I wanted to look over there badly enough that my eyes were watering from keeping them fixed toward the entrance instead. But something about the silence coming from that corner scared me more than if the person had actually spoken, because whoever it was knew I was awake. I was certain of that. and they were choosing not to say anything. At one point I became aware of another sound underneath the breathing, a soft dragging noise against the back wall, not scratching exactly, more like fingertips moving slowly across damp wood, back and forth, back and forth. I don't know how long this went on because eventually fear completely ruins your sense of time. It could have been 40 minutes or 3 hours. All I know is that the breathing never changed distance once, never moved closer, never moved farther away. It just stayed there in the dark with me. Sometime close to morning the sound stopped abruptly, not faded, stopped. The silence afterward felt so immediate and complete that it honestly scared me worse than the breathing had. I don't think I slept again after that. The first gray light finally started coming through the front of the shelter maybe an hour later, and I sat up almost immediately. The shelter was empty, no person, no pack, nothing. I got to my feet fast enough that my legs cramped and checked outside before my brain had really caught up yet. The mud around the entrance still held clear prints from my boots coming in the night before. There were no other tracks anywhere, none coming toward the shelter, none leaving. I remember standing there staring at the ground trying to force it to make sense because I knew what I heard during the night. I knew there had been breathing inside that shelter. Then I noticed the back wall. Directly underneath the carved word, "Don't," were 6 fresh grooves cut into the wood, thin parallel marks about the length of a finger. The exposed wood inside them looked pale and damp compared to the older carvings around them. They hadn't been there the night before. I'm completely certain of that because I remember staring directly at that wall while setting up my sleeping bag, and lower down near the floor, partly hidden beneath dirt and old leaves, I noticed another carving I somehow hadn't seen earlier, a name, Calhoun Reed. The letters were deep enough that they looked decades old. I packed everything in less than 5 minutes and left without eating breakfast. The entire hike back uphill I had the constant feeling that somebody was walking behind me just out of sight, not close enough to catch up, just close enough that every time I stopped moving I expected another footstep half a second later. But I never actually heard one. I didn't tell anybody about the shelter for months because I knew how impossible it sounded. Eventually though curiosity got to me and I started trying to figure out whether the name carved into the wall meant anything. Calhoun Reed isn't a common name. After a while I found an archived newspaper article from 1974 about a missing college student who disappeared during a solo hiking trip somewhere in that same region of the plateau. His name was Calhoun Reed. The article itself wasn't especially detailed, mostly just information about search efforts and weather conditions. But one sentence near the bottom bothered me enough that I still remember it almost word for word. It said search teams located Reed's campsite on the 3rd day and noted that his belongings appeared carefully arranged rather than abandoned, with no signs of struggle or hurried departure. That wording stuck with me immediately because it sounded wrong, not missing, not scattered, arranged, like somebody had simply stepped away from camp for a minute and never returned. I don't know if that shelter was connected to him or not. Maybe the carving had nothing to do with the article, maybe somebody else put it there years later. But I know the fresh marks underneath the word on that wall were new, and I know something sat awake with me inside that shelter for hours without ever showing itself. Sometimes what bothers me most isn't even the breathing anymore, it's the idea that whatever was there had done this before often enough that it was keeping count of something, and for whatever reason, that morning, the number changed again. Story 2. My name is Lauren Pike. I'm 35, and I work as a respiratory therapist in western Pennsylvania. I mention that because my job has made me pretty difficult to rattle. I spend most of my days around people in panic, people hallucinating from oxygen deprivation, people saying strange things while heavily medicated. And because of that I'm careful about assigning meaning to experiences before I've exhausted every normal explanation first. I've tried doing that with this one for almost a year now and I still can't make it fit into anything reasonable. Last August I took 8 days off and drove down to eastern Tennessee to hike part of the Appalachian Trail alone. I'd done solo backpacking trips for years and had already been through that general region twice before with friends, so nothing about the trip felt unfamiliar to me. By the 4th day I was in a good rhythm. My pack had gotten lighter after eating through supplies. The weather was holding steady, and I hadn't seen another hiker in close to 2 days, which honestly was part of why I liked that section so much. Late that afternoon I reached a small unofficial campsite about a quarter-mile off the main trail, just a clearing in the trees with a stone fire ring and enough level ground for 2 tents. The first thing I noticed was a tarp shelter already set up near the far edge of the clearing. It was well pitched too, proper tension, clean lines. Somebody experienced had put it together. I remember actually feeling relieved seeing it because remote campsites usually feel safer when somebody else is nearby. I set my own tent up across the clearing, made dinner, filtered water from a nearby creek, and sat for a while watching the trees move overhead before it got dark. Around sunset the other camper came back into camp. He was probably late 50s, broad shoulders, heavy boots, gray beard. The kind of face you see on people who spend most of their lives outdoors. Not unfriendly exactly but quiet in a very deliberate way. He introduced himself as Warren. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about normal trail things, water conditions farther north, how crowded the shelters had been earlier in the season, whether the rain was supposed to move in over the weekend. Nothing about the conversation itself stood out to me later. What I remember are his hands. Both were wrapped in gauze across the palms and underneath the fingers, not sloppy wrapping either. It was done carefully, evenly tensioned, clean tape placement, enough coverage to protect the skin without restricting movement. I noticed things like that professionally and immediately assumed he'd either done it himself with experience or had somebody medically trained do it for him recently. I asked if he'd hurt himself somewhere on the trail. For a second he just stared at his hands like he didn't recognize them. Then he said, "Not exactly." That was all he offered. I didn't push him after that because people on long solo hikes sometimes get strange about privacy, and honestly nothing about him felt dangerous at the time. We both turned in not long after dark, and for the first few hours everything was completely quiet. Then sometime during the night I woke up abruptly without knowing why. No noise at first, just awake. I remember lying there listening to the trees and reaching for my water bottle when I heard it, digging. Not animal movement, not scratching, actual digging, a slow, deliberate sound of earth being broken apart somewhere beyond my tent wall, steady enough that after a few seconds I realized whoever was doing it had probably been at it for a while already. There was something unnerving about how methodical it sounded. No frustration, no hurry, just consistent repeated movement. Like somebody performing work they already knew would take hours. The digging continued for a long time. I remember checking my watch at one point and seeing it was a little after 2 o'clock in the morning. After that I mostly just lay there listening and trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation for it. Maybe he dropped something. Maybe he was burying trash away from camp. Maybe there was some normal practical reason a man would spend hours digging in the woods in complete darkness, but the sound never changed. Slow repeated breaks in the soil followed by brief pauses, then more digging, steady enough that eventually it stopped sounding like a person working and started sounding mechanical, almost ritualistic. At one point I considered unzipping the tent just to ask if everything was alright, but something about the consistency of the sound kept stopping me. It didn't feel like somebody who wanted to be interrupted. Eventually sometime close to dawn the digging stopped completely, not gradually, just silence all at once. I must have fallen asleep after that because the next thing I remember was pale morning light coming through the tent walls. The campsite was empty. Warren's tarp was gone along with all his gear. No goodbye, no footprints leading back toward the trail that I could immediately see, nothing. I figured he must have packed up early while I was asleep until I noticed the disturbed ground near the fire ring, about 6 feet from where his tarp had been. There was a hole dug into the earth roughly the width of a car tire and maybe 18 inches deep. The dirt beside it had been piled neatly to one side instead of scattered around, like whoever dug it intended to fill it back in afterward. What unsettled me most was how precise it looked. Clean edges, straight depth, no roots torn randomly through the soil. It looked less like somebody searching for something and more like somebody already knew exactly where to dig. I walked closer after a minute and saw something pressed into the bottom of the hole, a handprint, just one. The gauze texture from the bandaging was visible in the dirt clearly enough that I recognized it immediately. Whoever made it had pressed their palm flat against the bottom hard enough to leave the entire pattern behind, not accidentally either, deliberately, like they were feeling for something underneath the soil. I left the campsite less than half an hour later. The farther I got from that clearing the less reasonable the entire thing started to feel. By the time I reached the trailhead later that afternoon I'd convinced myself enough to call the local ranger station and describe the man I'd met along with the digging and the hole. The ranger who answered listened quietly through most of it and then asked me to describe the bandaging on his hands again. I remember repeating the details because that question caught me off guard. After that there was a long pause on the line. Then she said, "We know who you're talking about." Something about the way she said it made my stomach drop immediately. I asked what she meant. She told me they'd received similar reports over the last few years from hikers in roughly the same section of trail, always a middle-aged man camping alone, always digging during the night, always leaving before sunrise. I asked if they knew what he was searching for. She said no. Then after another pause she added something I still think about constantly. She said they'd investigated several of the holes after hikers reported them and had never found anything inside. The wording bothered me immediately. Not, never found what he was looking for. Never found anything. I remember asking her what that was supposed to mean and she just said she didn't know. I drove home the next morning instead of finishing the trip. For months afterward I kept thinking about his hands because professionally that part bothered me more than anything else. The bandaging had been too well done to ignore, even pressure, correct placement, clean circulation gaps near the joints. Somebody who understood wound care had either treated his hands or taught him how to do it properly a long time ago, and the injuries underneath had clearly happened before. Not fresh panic injuries, repeated damage, the kind you prepare for because you already know it's coming. That's the part one still can't stop thinking about, not the digging itself, the preparation for it, the expectation, like this was something he had done many times before. Over the last year I've made lists in my head trying to explain it logically: illegal burial sites, hidden supplies, mental illness, obsessive behavior, but none of those explanations fully account for the way that hole looked or the handprint pressed into the bottom of it, because it didn't look like somebody digging randomly through the forest. It looked like somebody arriving at a location they already recognized, like they expected something to be there waiting underneath the soil, and whatever they were searching for had apparently been there before often enough that they kept coming back trying to find it again. Sometimes I still think about the expression on Warren's face when I first asked about his hands, that brief moment where he looked down at them almost absent-mindedly, like he'd forgotten the injuries were even there. It wasn't embarrassment, it wasn't shame, it was exhaustion. The kind you see in people who have repeated the same action for so long that pain has stopped meaning anything to them beyond being part of the process. I don't know what he believed was buried out there, but I think he found it once. Honestly, that's the only explanation that still makes sense to me. Not that he was searching for something unknown, but that years earlier he'd already seen it, touched it, maybe even pulled it out of the ground briefly, and whatever it was somehow ended up buried again somewhere deeper in those woods, because people don't keep returning to the same remote stretch of forest for years, destroying their hands in the dark unless they're chasing something they already know is real.